I know something you might not know. It's not exactly a fact that I can just tell you, like how conservation efforts in northern Michigan had caused an explosion in the great wolf population. Or that my frigid state's abandoned copper mines were not the place we had intended on going caving. I still remember that night in a bar where, in a day's fury of whiskey shots between the both of us, he first pitched the idea that I should join him on his yearly Upper Peninsula hiking escape. I remember how I had reluctantly agreed despite my plans to spend that particular weekend glued to the couch. That elated pat of approval which nearly spilt my drink is one thing that sticks in my mind quite fervently. We'd managed to be great friends for years despite the fact that I was a homeboy, and he strictly found happiness outdoors. This was due in part to the fact that we were both booze hounds. Only then I found myself thick in uncomfortable snow gear and snared by a binding blizzard which seemed to all but inhibit his movements. The only light in the sky was dull red of twilight glowing above the snow-capped evergreens. The equipment we carried was making my joints ache. Even though he'd offered to shoulder most of the burden, I carried no less than my fair share since he had provided it all. We planned to set up camp overnight, then explore the caves in the morning, which required gear for camping, cooking, and climbing, creating a hefty rustle with each step crunching the new fallen snow. What I know is more of a concept that I can only hope to elucidate through careful construction of context. I only ask that you judge my actions introspectively as I attempt to explain myself to you. Slowly but surely, we had drifted from the trail as a dizzying number of trees and snow covering the twisting path left us constantly second-guessing ourselves to where we were at. Even a meticulous eye on the compass couldn't help us keep walking straight through the haze of biting wind and obfuscating white. When we happened upon that clearing, we had no choice but to set up shelter amongst the stumps of that log section of forest, leaving me increasingly grateful to be lugging around our large, insulated dome tent. Even as I stood shivering through the harsh fury, he had set up a structure within minutes on his own, only breathing a sigh of relief once we both crawled inside. Pouring the whiskey we brought would be dangerous in this cold, so we focused instead on huddling amongst the thermal sleeping tents and dim lanterns. I had set aside my complaints and discomfort as we sweat through stories and trail mix, just like any typical night at the bar. What I know is as underlying as not only necessity, but as nature itself. I will tell you what I know because it can be said in one word. The howling began at a distance, barely even registering in our minds, just another faint cry of many creatures we shared the forest with. The first time it was loud enough to interrupt our stories, the shiver crawled up our backs and he reached to turn the dial of the lantern, just in case. We were quieter now, our camaraderie suppressed to a dull whisper, becoming more and more sparse until being finally overtaken by silence. The last cries of the peak had not sounded far away, though enough time was passing for security to peek its timid head, only to withdraw once more as a growl made our eyes shoot open. I remember how my chest ached as we knelt by the plastic window, unzipping the canvas coverings to peer out into distant lines of trees beyond the stumps. Nausea gripped my stomach when I carried the sight, the first pair of eyes cutting through the darkness, reflecting the moon's pale glow. More and more pairs were quick to dot that tree line lingering just outside. I nearly screamed when he suddenly clenched my wrist to pull me outside before we were completely surrounded. We ended up leaving our gear behind except for a light rucksack of caving equipment, refusing to enter our line of sight. The eyes and snarls dashed menacingly along the converse as we sprinted further into the man-made clearing, already wheezing as my coat fluttered behind me, the twigs snapping under my foot. We thought that we were lucky to have encountered this cavern along this log-side hill, a rocky burrow created through narrow horizontal passages into a mining tunnel below. When I placed my hand on the unassuming mound for support as we fled, my stomach dropped at the sheerness of the pit within. To enter would mean a fall of at least 50 feet, though it would be our best chance of evading the predators. So we both braced ourselves. I could scarcely even breathe looking down into the snow-banked excavation. Every instinct tried to pull me back, crying out, "Don't jump, you idiot!" It was all my stupid idea. What I know is hunger. Hunger isn't a feeling you get right before dinner or after skipping breakfast or lunch. I would have claimed to have felt hunger before now, but it was only discomfort. Hunger isn't just a dull ache of an unfulfilled routine, but a fierce agitation of the body that wastes away without reprieve. It takes absolute present, consuming every thought. It becomes unequivocally lost in their own hunger. By the time we had time to go down the steep drop, laying crippled in the snow and dirt, the predators had undoubtedly moved on to a more accessible meal, though my friend had landed on his forearm, fracturing it as a result of the fall. The clear agony in his stifled expression made my skin bristle and crawl with sympathy, and I could hardly stand to look at the swollen, twisted limb that stood before me. Even though we had rope and pittance, climbing out was not an option. I lacked the physicality to make the escape on my own, and his injuries crippled him, leaving us with only one option: progressing further into the abandoned mines. He guided my hand as I used the pythons as straps from a harness to bind his arms in a makeshift splint before helping him to his feet. The air was completely still except for a burrow far above, and the dusty beams and torches lining the shaft had been long since abandoned. Our only recourse is to start walking and hope for an exit. Of course, hope is one of the many things that hush by deafening wails of hungry pangs in a weary body. Time was the first of the things I began to lose track of, as well as my sense of direction, as the shaft seemed to twist and loop endlessly, intercut by maze-like and narrow tunnels. Familiar, perhaps, to some long-dead foreman. I grew to despise our footsteps made as they echoed in maddeningly unpredictable patterns against rock and soil. We willed our bodies forward, certain that an exit could just be around the next corner, until we became too exhausted and stopped to rest. Even though we still held out hope to wander our way to freedom, we rationed out what little water we had responsibly, preparing to make it last as long as possible. And so we continued pressing on time and time again with our tenacity, constantly unrewarded. I imagined the world outside carrying on without me, not even noticing the fact that I hadn't returned from a hiking trip days after the scheduled time, not even bothering to search the wet, muggy air of the caves that stung my throat miserably, and the soles of my feet stung horribly with each passing step. At first, my friend matched my resolve pound for pound, encouraging me onwards, but before long I could see that he too was slowing and growing weaker. The fracture in his arm became even more swollen than before, terribly discovered and leaking a putrid, infected pus, but we still shuffled on in our cycle of exhausted sleep and wandering. Something changed. Something changed. Now we weren't even speaking with one another anymore. Our water reserves had run dry, and the terrible hunger choked out whatever resolve remained. We could scarcely even move if we wanted to, lying face to face on opposite sides of the mine shaft in complete resignation to our fate. The atmosphere was pure, visceral dread as we both awaited the end in the cold darkness, completely empty and alone. Would we even realize it when we died? My awareness was shrieking as I faded in and out of consciousness, sprawled out on the tunnel's ground. I could barely register the sickness which gripped my friend. Only a short distance away. He was completely drained of strength. He couldn't fight off this infection from his fracture much longer, and it put a considerable toll on his health as he wheezed and quivered, turning terribly thin and pale. I could tell at a glance he'd be gone soon, leaving me on my own in these winding, inescapable tunnels. On the forefront of each thought was my now intimately familiar hunger, a sensation so powerful and exquisitely pervasive that it completely overtakes the mind, crushing it into something primeval. Something unflinching in its detachment that could hardly even be called human. I'm telling you that I know hunger in the hopes that you will forgive me. I don't exactly know when my friend died, if it was starvation or infection that did him in, or if it could have been avoided if we had it hidden away in this godforsaken caverns in the first place. But every urge in my body focused to a point. A disgusting proposal floating on the top of my meddling hunger. All signs of life had all vanished, and his pulse was entirely absent. I recalled the wolves and how we had denied them fulfillment from that oppressive hunger. How I sought something similar and so completely perverse. My fingertips danced over to the pallid skin as I found myself having drawn too close, investigating the cadaver and subsequently appraising it. As much as I hate to admit it, what use did he have for flesh anymore anyway? These thoughts could hardly even be called my own. I wouldn't have been able to tear skin away with my bare hands, not in my weakened state. My tantalized digits drifted over to the splint, pulling one of the pythons free as my hands quivered in disbelief. Hunger had completely strangled my appeals to my frazzled mind that they made to decency. The metal stake felt heavy in my hands, and I closed my eyes tautly, repeating to myself again and again, he wouldn't feel a thing. Just to steel myself. My salivating jaw quivered as I positioned the pointed tip to pluck free the most tender and accessible meat available. There was only slight resistance from the soft surface of his left eye as the membrane is breached by the stake. The pitton's intersection smooth and swift before being drawn back with a firm tug. My shaking fingernails are more than sufficient to tear away the stake attached to the back of the round opening, leaving blood drizzling down his face as I popped a macabre reward into my mouth. It torn easily between my teeth. A man's gotta eat, right? The sustenance providing the corpse beneath my muck-covered knees didn't even remind me of a friend anymore, and the thought of his wife or children held no place in my mind as I punctured the top of his chest cavity with the python before dragging downwards towards the skin. The sensation was like tearing a particularly tough and clammy leather, and disembowelment filled my soiled, clenching hands with a variety of succulent meats. Perhaps even then I had become something completely different, something violently ravenous as I lifted these greedy piles of what had been my friend's insides into my salivating maw, skin and organ alike devoured with wanted detachment, squishing heartily between grinding fangs as I completely had given in. I know something else you might not know. Between my gnashing teeth and tearing fingers is a dull sensation of being watched, unable to draw myself away from my first meal, and over a week I grew tentative and tense at it, increasingly apparent that myself was being appraised by some unnatural presence, being judged from my actions I had taken to survive. Before I could dwell on this for far too long, my meal was interrupted by a low, rumbling laughter. My filled mouth grunted with distress as I pulled myself back to another wall of the mineshaft, scrambling away at the realization that the laughter had come from behind me. Much like the hunger, what I now know is something I've had to discover and reconcile with in my unnerving brush with morality. I'd learned that there's a price to pay for eating these flesh in these woods. Surely my disemboweled friend begun to rise as the separate flaps over his torso begun to hang loose and open, allowing what gnarled viscera that remained to spill forward onto the dirt below. His missing left eye offered a disturbing view of the howled and bloodied caverns now exposed within his skull. What had I done? You can't be serious, he snarled fiercely, face twisting with bemused rage like he might break out in laughter or explode at any moment. I could do naught but slink back with a guilty whimper, my thoughts and reasoning suppressed by deafening hunger. I could not even fathom what caused my friend to rise, or if this was some sort of hallucination, but what had possessed his ravaged body was something unnatural. Still, he pressed forward with his supernatural jerking movements, flashing his reddened teeth as his words bored holes into my head, blood spit flying from his frothing, enraged lips. How could you go and do such a stupid thing, giving yourself to him? What in God's name were you thinking? I had never heard him take such an intense and hostile tone in my life. As my lungs burned, I hyperventilated in the muggy air, my chest rising and falling erratically as my gaze locked with one of the remaining eyes in that vindictive body shuffling towards me until it loomed overhead, creating a splitting pain in each temple. Just as the body descended onto me to pin me against a wall, I threw myself out of the way, recuperating on my knees just a short distance away before pushing back onto my feet and scrambling down the open tunnel, desperate to escape this mortifying consequence of my actions. A terrified and guttural wail built in my throat as my arms and legs pumped in reckless sprint. Tattered boots smacking against the compact dirt and echoing down the twisting caverns. I knew only one thing, and that is I must run, but I had no idea where to go. Suddenly, the pressure in my temples bursted forth, sending me crashing to my knees in agony before writhing on my back. Twisting and thrashing, I placed my hands on my head. I could feel twisted, bony protrusions sprouting forth, pushing free from my skull with an awful grinding crunch, which made my eyes water and my teeth grit. My wails, throats of pain reverberated through the caverns, only to be answered by one creature. A brown cloaked figure loomed above me as my head racked with agony. A quiet observer who had only now drawn near. Its head was a bleached deer skull, sporting an imposing pair of familiar-looking antlers, though the blinding pain which wrecked every fiber of my being, I couldn't feel any fear towards this creature, instead just belonging. There was a price to pay for satisfying my hunger with such inhuman depravity, and humanity was precisely the debt I incurred. Hunger had regressed my mind into something detached and animalistic, and now I was changing to reflect that. Now I belonged to the Mordeo. Discarding the flesh peeling from my face and head in droves, I threw my head back in another stark cry. A cry for a hunt. A cry to feed. And let me tell you something. There's only one thing I know now, and it's a thing that I told you, and it's a thing I can sum up with only one word. And the only thing is, I still know. Hunger.
Watch new scary vids every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday.